All right, welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the topic of classical conditioning. Now, classical conditioning was discovered by a Russian physiologist. His name was Ivan Pavlov. Now, interesting, like a lot of the researchers we talked about in this class, he was not a psychologist by training. He was actually a physiologist. And what he wanted to do is to extract out saliva from the salivatory ducts of a dog. The reason being is that back in the early 1900s, they would use the dog saliva for medicinal purposes. However, during his research on the digestive process, which he actually won the Nobel Prize for, he discovered by circumstance the principles of classical conditioning. And this is actually what he's more famous for. So let me explain to you initially what he did in his research. And also, if you watch the video, you can get a good idea what he did in the video also. But basically what he did is he set up the dog in a little contraption that looked like this. And what he wanted the dog to do was to salivate so he can get the saliva from the dog. Now, in order to get the dog to salivate, you had to present it with a stimulus so that the dog can do it when you want them to and not have to wait, until it's time for them to salivate. So basically what he did is he would present food to the dog, which would cause the dog to salivate. Now, during the course of his studies, he also found out that if you introduce another stimulus, such as a ticking metronome or maybe a ringing of a bell or something of that nature, after a while, because the sound of the bell or the metronome was associated with the presentation of the food, the dog would start to salivate just by ringing a bell or by hearing a ticking metronome. And this is the basic principles of classical conditioning. And these are also the basic principles that explain how we learn things such as phobias and taste aversions. So the problem that we have, though, is that when he translated his writings from Russian to English, there is some terminology that's a little bit problematic. He uses the term conditioning, which simply means learning. And if you remember that, that makes this word salad problem that we're going to run into a lot easier to understand. There are different types of terms that we're going to be running into. We have neutral stimuli, we have unconditioned stimuli, we have conditioned stimuli, we have unconditioned responses and conditioned responses. Sometimes we use the symbols NS for neutral stimulus, UCS and UCR for the unconditioned stimuli and responses, CSs and CRs for conditioned stimuli and conditioned responses. So I'll use both of these in the lecture. And also when we take the quizzes and when we take the exams, I'll use both terms just to help you guys out with it. But honestly, as long as you remember that conditioning is the same thing as learning, this is going to make this a whole lot easier to understand and to remember. Also, a good way to understand it is to think about three different phases of conditioning or three different phases of learning. We have what happens before learning, what happens during learning, and what happens after learning. And if you remember it as a sequence of steps or stages, then it makes it a lot easier to understand what's really going on with conditioning. So let's talk about before conditioning first. What happens here is that we have what's called a neutral stimulus. A neutral stimulus is a stimulus that has no effect on behavior whatsoever. So for example, the first time that you ring a bell, the dog may have what's called an orienting reflex. They may turn to see where the noise is coming from. Their ears may perk up. They may be a little bit curious, but they're not going to have any other type of response besides that. So it's called neutral because it doesn't have any effect on their behavior. So it's a neutral stimulus. On the other hand, before learning takes place, if we present the dog with dog food, the dog will automatically start to salivate. Now, this is something that's biologically innate within the dogs. They smell the dog food, they're going to salivate. That's just the way the digestive process works. Same thing happens with humans, not to the same extent, but sometimes you may have noticed that when you're cooking dinner, maybe you're really hungry, you smell the food, you open up your mouth, some saliva squirts out, same exact thing, okay? So because nothing is being learned here, because this is automatic, this is called an unconditioned stimulus, which is the food, and the unconditioned response is going to be the salivation. And remember, stimuli always precede responses. So you have a stimulus that produces a response. Presentation of the meat causes the dog to salivate. Now, the next phase is what happens during learning. So during learning, something has to be acquired or something has to be learned for the organism. So what's going to happen here is that we're going to ring the bell. And there's a little bit change in terminology here because now we're going to call the neutral stimulus a conditioned stimulus because learning has taken place. So it's called a conditioned stimulus because now we're being conditioned or we're being learned. Something's being learned. Now what's being learned is the association between the ringing of the bell and the presentation of the food. So what you do is you ring the bell, give the dog food, the dog is going to salivate. So as you can see at the top, right up here, I'll move my cursor right by it, you have the CF, which is the conditioned stimulus, plus the unconditioned stimulus is going to produce the unconditioned response. So this is what's being learned. The dog learns that there's an association between the CS and the UCS. And the reason why this is important is because in the last stage, after learning takes place, now just by ringing the bell, the dog will start to salivate. So now, since learning has taken place, the bell is going to be the conditioned stimulus, which is going to produce a conditioned response or learned response, which is salivation. Now, still salivation is the same thing as before during the learning phase, or actually before learning, the still salivation, but because it's associated with a conditioned stimulus, it's going to be called a conditioned response. So that's all there is to conditioning. And once you understand the basic terminology, it's really not that difficult to understand. However, sometimes salivating dogs are not the best examples. Let's give you some other examples that might be a little bit better. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this next screen up right here just to show you what happens before learning, during learning, and after learning, just to kind of remind you. So a better example might be is that suppose that you have a dog, as my dog is barking in the back there. Suppose that you have a dog and you want to start giving them canned dog food to eat. The first time you turn on the can opener to open up the can, the dog's going to have a curious response. They'll have that ornery reflex once again. They'll turn to see where the noise is coming from, but they're not going to start salivating. They're not going to run to the food bowl or anything like that. Then when you put the dog food in the bowl, the dog will run to his bowl, start to salivate, and eat the dog food. Now after a while, once you start to do this, the dog learns that when you turn on the can opener, that means they're going to be given food. And now, after learning takes place, all you need to do is turn on the can opener, the dog comes running to his food bowl. Now what's kind of funny about this is that sometimes you may be cooking dinner, maybe you're just opening up a can of green beans or corn or something like that. The dog doesn't know that. They just know that when you turn on the can opener, that means they're probably going to get fed, so they're going to come charging to their food bowl anyways. Sometimes, another example here, sometimes when your cat's outside, you want your cat to run inside, you call its name, it doesn't come. So then what you do is you go get its food bowl, you shake it, shake it, shake it. The cat hears the food shaking in the food container. They come running inside the house because they expect to be fed. So this kind of happens all the time. There's a lot of different examples out there that we're not even aware of. Kind of other interesting example would be is suppose a mother has a newborn infant. Now, the first time the infant cries, the cry is going to be a neutral stimulus because the mom doesn't know why the baby's crying. Could be that they are tired, could be that they are wet, could be that they're cold, could be that they're hungry. Who knows? So anyways, the baby cries. The mom becomes aware of the baby's crying. She wonders what's going on. But it's not going to produce any type of response within her besides just being wondering what's going on with my baby. Now, suppose the baby's hungry. What's going to happen now is that when the baby starts to suckle on the mother's breast, the mother will start to lactate. So now the unconditioned stimulus is going to be the baby sucking. The unconditional response is going to be lactation. Now what's going to happen is that after this happens a couple times, the baby cries, the mother feeds the mother has a baby suckle on the mother's nipple, the mother lactates. This is going to happen during the learning phase, so that after conditioning takes place, now when the baby cries, the mom will start to lactate. Now what's important to note about this is that suppose you're going to go shopping down at Target or go to the grocery store, someplace like that. You need to be aware that if your baby starts to cry, you may start to leak a little bit of breast milk because the body's been conditioned to the baby's crying. And this is the reason why many women may wear breast pads when they are breastfeeding, because they may have a little bit of leakage because of this phenomenon. Now, also what we need to know is there are a couple other principles that are related to this, and this is some terms that you should know. First, we have what's called acquisition. This is the learning period when the CS is paired with the UCS. So we're acquiring knowledge, we're acquiring something being learned, so that's what's going on here. In addition to that, we have which is called extinction. This is the unlearning of the CR due to repeated presentations of the CS without the UCS. So what this means is that suppose that we stop giving our dog canned dog food because it's too expensive. And now we're just going to give her dry food. So now what's going to happen is that whenever we turn on the can opener to open up our green beans or whatever it may be, the dog doesn't get fed. After a while, the dog is going to learn that the sound of the can opener no longer predicts that it's going to be fed, and so then it stops running to his food bowl. Now, depending on what you are trying to condition, the acquisition can be very quickly. When we talk about phobias, when we talk about taste aversions, it can just be one pairing. That's all it takes to learn this association. Sometimes it may take a few pairings, just depends. Extinction can either be very quick or it could maybe never happen. For example, many people today still have phobias, they still have taste aversions, even though it happened years and years and years ago. And even if you ate the same food again today, it's not going to make you sick, but you're still not going to eat it because you're afraid. Okay? Also, we have what's called generalization. This means that a stimulus similar to the original CS is able to elicit the CR. So maybe the mother goes to the store, she doesn't have her baby with her, but another baby starts to cry. Because that baby's cry can be generalized, she could also start to leak a little bit of breast milk due to a different baby's crying. That's called generalization. And then finally, we have what's called discrimination. This occurs when a stimulus that is similar to the original CS is not able to elicit the CR. So maybe you are giving your dog the canned dog food. Maybe the can opener breaks and you buy a new one that has a different sound to the motor. Maybe it doesn't produce the same type of response. Or maybe, for example, if you turn on the blender instead of the can opener, it still makes a noise that's kind of similar to the can opener, but not really. Maybe that doesn't produce it. So sometimes we can learn to discriminate different types of stimuli. So that's it for here. If you guys have questions, once again, send me an email message or we can discuss it during our weekly Zoom session, or make sure you also have the option of posting it to our Q&A discussion board where I can answer all the questions there for you. So hope you enjoyed the lecture, and we will talk to you guys again in the next video when we talk about phobias and taste aversions.